Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to tell you a myth so big, so grand, so larger than life, that even now after all these years, it still captures the human imagination. It's a myth that's made common everyday conversation. You'll probably know someone who's obsessed with it. Chances are you've heard about it. But just in case, here goes. This is the myth of Atlantis. Our story begins with the ancient Greeks. For centuries, they had a little problem. Nobody liked the Athenians. And when we say nobody, we mean it. The Spartans hated them. The Corinthians despised them. The Argives loathed them. Basically everyone was envious of Athens, because while everyone else was busy being small-time, third-rate city-states, Athens was out here building an empire. They were first, they were best. No one messed with Athens, everyone respected them. But then came a guy named Solon, who some would call the wisest man in the world, or at least in Greece. And one day he was chilling in his garden and contemplating life when he looked up and saw a bird pooping on his head. Now, this was a bad omen because birds dropping deuces on your head meant the gods weren't too thrilled about something. So Solon went to the oracle of Delphi and asked her what she was so mad about. She told him she was upset at Athens. You see, despite their size and power and influence, the Athenians were acting like they were too good for everyone else. They were arrogant. They thought they were better than everyone else, and the oracle told Solomon she needed him to put them in their place. So he wrote 2 poems. First he called it the Atthis. In it, he gave a history of Athens going all the way back to their origins, the birth of their civilization. And then he wrote another poem called the Cyprus. And in this poem, he talked about how much Athens had grown and how great they became because of their democracy. And then at the end he just casually dropped that their greatness would come to an end because of their own hubris. The gods would punish them, destroy them, and this prophecy followed Athens everywhere. They couldn't escape it. They tried to ignore it, they tried to stop it, but it never worked. And eventually, almost 200 years later, someone came along who was happy to capitalize on it. His name was Plato. He was a student of the philosopher Socrates and was widely considered one of the most brilliant minds of the ancient Greek era. He lived around 360 BCE, that's 2,300 years ago, give or take. And during his lifetime he wrote several philosophical dialogues, stories that featured characters like Socrates having conversations, and these dialogues explored the nature of humanity and society and knowledge. In fact, the majority of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato's writings. Anyway, in one of his dialogues called Timaeus, written around 360 BCE, he tells a story about Atlantis. Here's what he said. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where the sun and the stars are differently ordered, there lies an island that is bigger than Libya and Asia Minor put together. It was the strongest bulwark against the whole of Africa, Europe, and the free peoples who lived there. This island was a place of invincibility and the only place of that kind, since it was the only one that had ever been able to wage war against all of us and had not been subdued by any one of our forces. This island was called Atlantis. Now, unlike other civilizations that fell victim to natural disasters, disease, climate change, war, whatever, Atlantis wasn't like that. According to Plato, they fell in a single day and a single night, swallowed up by the earth and sunk beneath the sea, vanished forever, as punishment from the gods for their hubris, for forgetting who made them, for thinking they were too great, too powerful to be humbled. Atlantis was a warning to every nation that came after them. If you get too big for your britches, if you think you're too good for everyone else, then you deserve the same fate as Atlantis. Now, over the centuries, people have tried and tried and tried again to figure out where this legendary island was. Was it somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea? Maybe the Caribbean? Perhaps it was somewhere in Antarctica. Or maybe, just maybe, it was near the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There are people who believe all of these things. And when it comes to proving them wrong, well, there hasn't been much progress made there. In fact, of all the lost civilizations out there, the ones that are long gone but leave behind monuments and relics and pieces of themselves, Atlantis is the biggest enigma of them all. There's absolutely nothing left behind. No artifacts, no buildings, no trash, nothing. There's no evidence Atlantis ever existed. And one of the reasons people are so desperate to find it is because if they do, then it would prove once and for all that Plato's story was true. But the weird thing is, Plato might not have been writing about an actual place. See, as we mentioned before, Plato was a philosopher. He was a writer. He used stories to make his points. And some scholars believe that Atlantis was nothing more than a metaphor. It was a lesson and illustration. Take a look at this passage from Plato said Atlantis was a place of invincibility, the only place that had ever waged war against everyone else. But then at the very end of the dialogue he writes, and thus the Athenians did not easily endure such a disgrace, nor did they put up with being no longer the first in chief among men. Rather, they planned secretly to equip an expedition and recover the prize. What if Atlantis isn't a place? What if it's a state of mind, a moment of hubris, a brief lapse in judgment that caused the Athenians to lose their way? What if it's about how sometimes we allow our ambitions and desires to cloud our better judgment? Does that make sense? Well, yes it does. And it also fits with what the oracle said. Remember, she wanted Solomon to remind the Athenians that no matter how powerful they are, no matter how influential they become, the gods can and will bring them down. But let's go back to this idea that Atlantis could be a real place. Plato put a lot of effort into describing the island. He said it was close to the Strait of Gibraltar, past the Pillars of Hercules, and some people think he was referring to the island of Santorini. It's an island in the Aegean Sea, about 120 miles from Athens. Back in 1867, a British naval officer uncovered some artifacts on the island, and suddenly everybody thought they had found Atlantis. But the problem is that this predates Plato's story by about 3,000 years. Santorini is considered the home of the Minoan civilization, one of the first great civilizations in Greece. They reached their peak between 1700 and 1450 BC, and then in 1600 BCE the island experienced a massive volcanic eruption. The explosion unleashed 26 cubic miles of ash and pumice into the sky. It was one of the largest natural disasters in recorded history, and it wiped out the Minoan civilization and pretty much everything Plato described in his story. We're talking about earthquakes, massive waves, fires, widespread destruction. Could this be Atlantis? Well, it certainly fits. But there are problems with this theory, too. For starters, Santorini is nowhere near the Pillars of Hercules. It's thousands of miles away, basically in the opposite direction. Plus, there's no evidence of an army coming from Santorini to invade Athens. We should also mention Plato's description of Atlantis is kind of vague. He never really gives us details, which makes it hard to narrow down possibilities. All he says is it's somewhere past the Pillars of Hercules, which is cool, but it could be anywhere. And that's part of what makes Atlantis so fascinating. The ambiguity, the lack of detail. It leaves room for interpretation. People can draw their own conclusions, and some people have done exactly that. Others say Atlantis was somewhere in the Caribbean. Some say it's in Antarctica. There are people who believe it was near the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Others believe it was an inland sea in Utah or Nevada. Still, others believe it was a continent that sank into the Black Sea. There are also people who believe Atlantis was highly advanced, thousands of years ahead of its time. Some people say it had flying machines and laser weapons. Others say the Atlanteans were giants. These theories usually stem from fringe sources like the psychic Edgar Cayce, who claimed to have had visions of Atlantis, or Eric von Däniken, who believes aliens built the pyramids. And though none of these claims have any merit, they do make for entertaining dinner party conversations. So where is Atlantis? Is it real? Does it exist somewhere out there beneath the waves? Or is it just a story, a metaphor to teach us about ourselves and the mistakes we make? We don't know. And neither do you, and neither does anyone. The truth is, the legend of Atlantis captured the imagination of millions. It sparked interest in mythology and archaeology, and inspired countless books and movies and theories. It helped shape our view of the world and how we understand history, and that's why it matters. Thank you for watching.